The wind howled through the pines as snow swirled outside the cabin windows, cloaking the world in white. Inside, Thomas Grady sat alone in a creaking wooden chair, the firelight flickering across his weathered face. His silver beard caught the glow as he leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, watching the flames rise and fall like the quiet rhythm of a breath long held. Timber Creek, Wyoming, was never a place for the faint-hearted. Winters here were long, brutal, and unrelenting. But Tom had chosen this life, retreating into the Bighorn Mountains after retiring from the only job that had ever made sense to him, smokejumper. For 30 years, he'd leapt from plains into roaring infernos to save forests, towns, and sometimes people. Now, at 61, with knees that cracked like dry twigs and lungs that no longer welcomed high altitudes, he settled for fighting nothing but silence. His cabin sat 5 miles from the nearest dirt road, reachable only by snowmobile during the winter months. Most days were filled with chopping wood, clearing snow off the roof, and drinking black coffee as the radio buzzed with static. Solitude was a companion he'd come to respect. It didn't argue. It didn't leave. But the nights? The nights were longer. There had been a time when laughter filled these walls, his wife Marie humming while cooking stew, her boots clunking across the floor, the smell of cinnamon and old books. But that chapter had closed 2 winters ago, when illness came swift and silent, stealing her breath and leaving Tom with too much space and not enough sound. Outside, the snow piled higher against the cabin's edge. He rose slowly, joints stiff, and fed another log to the fire. It crackled in approval. The storm outside had been brewing all day, and by now, the blizzard had turned Timber Creek into a white void. Tom glanced at the clock. Just past 9. Another quiet night, or so he thought. He poured himself a mug of coffee from the old enamel pot on the stove and sat back down, the mug warming his calloused hands. The radio murmured low, playing some distant blues track between bursts of static. Occasionally, he flipped through the pages of an old novel he'd already read 3 times. He wasn't reading anymore, just holding it, for the memory of turning pages. As he sat there, surrounded by the crackle of the fire and the groan of the wind, Tom didn't know his life was about to shift. That behind the howling gusts and falling snow, something fragile and frozen was drawing closer. That outside his cabin door, destiny had already begun scratching. He took another sip of coffee, leaned back in his chair, and closed his eyes for just a moment. Outside, the storm howled louder. Inside, a man waited without knowing what was coming. The sharp sound came again, barely audible above the wind, but unmistakable. A faint, scratchy scraping against the wooden door. Thomas Grady's eyes opened. He sat still, listening. The fire cracked softly, and for a moment, he wondered if he'd imagined it. But then, it came again, a hesitant scratching, followed by a low, muffled whimper. He set his mug down slowly and stood, his boots heavy on the creaking floorboards. At first, his mind jumped to a tree branch or a drifting limb blown loose by the wind. But that whimper wasn't wind. That was something alive. Tom walked cautiously toward the front door, every instinct sharpened by years in dangerous places. He flicked off the interior lamp, letting the fire provide the only light. Slowly, he approached the window beside the door, wiping away the frost with the back of his hand. What he saw made him freeze. There, barely visible through the swirling snow, stood a large German shepherd, her body trembling in the cold. She was hunched low, her ribs sharp beneath her fur, and her paws planted firmly in the drift just outside the porch. But what truly caught Tom's breath were the 2 tiny shapes pressed against her belly, puppies, huddled beneath their mother's body, almost lost in the snow. Frost clung to her coat. Her ears were pinned back, and her breath escaped in thick, frantic clouds. But her eyes, those amber eyes locked with his, pleading and afraid, begging for something without words. Tom's hand hovered over the doorknob. Every practical thought he had screamed no. She was a stray, and strays could be sick, rabid, dangerous. This wasn't some backyard mutt. She was big, alert, and unpredictable. And she wasn't alone. But something deeper, older, louder rose from within. He saw not just a dog, but a mother standing in a storm, refusing to abandon her young. A mother on the edge of collapse, but not yet willing to give up. His breath fogged the glass. He whispered under it, almost in disbelief. "Where the hell did you come from?" Another whimper answered, this time from one of the pups. The smaller one shifted, its tiny body nearly swallowed by the snow. The shepherd didn't flinch. She held her position like a statue, shivering, guarding, waiting. Tom reached for the knob. The moment he cracked the door, a gust of wind punched through the room, scattering embers from the fireplace and biting at his skin. The dog didn't move. She didn't growl, didn't bark, didn't flinch. She just stared. "Come on, girl," Tom murmured, lowering his body to seem less threatening. "You'll freeze to death out there." The shepherd blinked slowly. Then, without breaking eye contact, she nudged one of the pups with her nose. It stumbled forward on unsteady legs. When it couldn't keep up, she gently picked it up by the scruff. The second pup followed behind her, shivering with each step. And just like that, she crossed the threshold. As the mother shepherd stepped inside, the door eased shut behind her with a dull thud, muffling the howling wind. The shift in temperature was instant. From blizzard to warmth. From death's reach to firelight. Yet the dog didn't relax. Her body remained low, her muscles tight, her amber eyes darting around the room with a soldier's vigilance. Tom stood frozen for a moment, hands still resting on the door. Snow clung to the dog's fur in clumps, slowly melting into dark patches on the floor. The pup dangling from her mouth whimpered softly. She padded cautiously toward the hearth, her every step measured, cautious but deliberate. She gently placed the pup on the folded rug near the fireplace. The other stumbled after her, collapsing into a heap beside its sibling. Tom stepped back, giving her space. He didn't speak. Words didn't feel right yet. She turned to face him, her eyes narrowing just slightly, a quiet warning. Not a growl. Not a threat. Just a silent declaration, "These are mine. I will protect them." "I get it," Tom said quietly, holding up both hands. "You're a damn good mother." He walked slowly toward the couch, reaching for the thick wool blanket draped across its back. She tensed. He paused, watching her. Then, in slow motion, he lifted the blanket and lowered it to the floor beside her. She didn't move. Just watched. The fire cracked behind them, casting flickers of orange and gold on the walls. The pups, exhausted from the cold, huddled together in the warmth, tiny bodies rising and falling with shallow breaths. She finally settled, curling her body protectively around them, her side pressed close to the flame's gentle heat. Her breathing was uneven. Her fur, now damp from melted snow, clung to her gaunt frame. Tom could see her ribs shift with every breath. He walked into the kitchen, boots thudding softly against the floor. From the cupboard he pulled a shallow metal bowl, filled it with warm, not hot, water, and placed it a few feet from her. She watched him, ears flicking, eyes unreadable. After a long moment, she leaned forward and began to lap it up, her tongue trembling from exhaustion. Tom sat down on the floor nearby, not close, but close enough to see her clearly. He studied the pups. Their eyes weren't even fully open. One had fur as pale as fresh snow. The other was the color of ash. "You weren't out there for hours," Tom murmured. "You've been out there for days." The shepherd paused, lifting her head slowly. Their eyes met. There was no trust in her gaze yet, but something else, a flicker of understanding, of shared silence between two creatures who'd both been alone too long. Tom leaned back, letting out a slow breath. "Well," he said, voice barely above a whisper. "Looks like we're not alone tonight, after all." The fire popped softly, a comforting rhythm in the stillness. Outside, the storm raged on, snow slamming against the cabin walls like desperate hands. Inside, the warmth began to settle over the small room like a blanket, wrapping itself around three fragile lives that had no business surviving a night like this. Tom didn't move for a long time. He sat cross-legged on the worn rug, a few feet from the German shepherd, watching the rise and fall of her sides as she lay curled around her puppies. They were finally sleeping, if shallowly. One had its tiny nose buried into its sibling's side, the other's paw rested against its mother's chest. The shepherd's eyes remained open, alert, tracking every breath Tom took. He didn't try to get closer. Instead, he quietly got up and rummaged through a storage chest near the fireplace. Inside was an old fleece-lined dog bed, dusty from years untouched. It had belonged to Sadie, his dog from years ago, before Marie had gotten sick. He hadn't looked at it since the day she passed. He hesitated, fingers brushing the edges, then pulled it free and placed it gently beside the shepherd. "I guess it's time to dust this old thing off," he murmured. She didn't move. But her eyes shifted toward it, then back to him. Tom grabbed another blanket from the couch and draped it over a nearby chair before settling into it with a sigh. He didn't bother turning off the flickering lamp in the corner. Something told him sleep wouldn't come easy tonight. The shepherd stirred slightly, adjusting her position as the pups nuzzled deeper against her. Her body trembled intermittently, whether from the cold still leaving her bones, the fear buried deep in her memory, or simple exhaustion, he couldn't tell. Tom could see the hesitation in every twitch of her muscles. She was here, yes, but not fully here. Not yet. "Whatever you've been through," he said quietly, "you didn't give up. That counts for something." He leaned back and closed his eyes. His thoughts drifted, uninvited, to the past. To long drives with Marie. To Sadie riding in the back of the truck with her head out the window. To the sound of laughter echoing through this very cabin. All of it seemed so far away now, like a story that happened to someone else. He glanced back at the shepherd. Her eyes were half closed now, still cautious, still guarded, but no longer wide with alarm. The firelight flickered across her fur, drying the melted snow clinging to her coat. Tom felt something shift inside him, something small but undeniable. It wasn't comfort, not yet. But it was a crack in the silence. A question forming in the heart of a man who'd long stopped asking anything of life. "You're not just passing through, are you?" he asked softly. No answer came. But the pups slept deeper. The dog didn't flinch when he spoke. And for the first time in years, Tom didn't feel entirely alone. Morning came slowly, the gray light filtering through frost-covered windows like a whisper. The storm had passed, leaving behind a deep hush that blanketed the forest outside. Snow draped the trees in heavy silence. Inside the cabin, the fire had burned low, but a lingering warmth still clung to the room. Tom stirred beneath the blanket on the chair, his back stiff, neck aching. He opened his eyes and blinked toward the hearth. The shepherd was still there, her body curled protectively around her two pups. Their small limbs were stretched out now, no longer huddled in tight fear. One kicked softly in its sleep, pawing at the warm air. The mother's ears flicked at the sound of Tom's shifting, but she didn't lift her head. That was new. He rose quietly and added a few logs to the fire. The flames flared back to life with a gentle roar. The warmth returned in waves. Tom poured water into a pot and set it on the stove. He was halfway through his routine before realizing how strange it felt to have a routine again, one that involved someone, or something, other than himself. The shepherd finally lifted her head as he moved through the kitchen. Her eyes tracked him, still guarded but no longer tight with alarm. She stretched her front legs forward, letting out a long breath before settling back down. The pups began to stir, mewling softly. One, ash-gray with a white stripe along its nose, rolled onto its side and opened its eyes just a sliver. The other, smaller and cream-colored, burrowed under its mother's chest. Tom crouched a short distance away, watching them in silence. "You've got strong little ones," he said, his voice calm and low. "Tougher than they look." He slid a bowl of warm water closer. The shepherd watched it for a moment, then slowly leaned forward and drank. She finished it in long, deliberate laps. Tom took that as permission. He returned to the kitchen, opened a can of chicken soup, and poured it into a shallow dish. When he set it down near her, she sniffed the air, cautious but tempted. As she ate, Tom sat back, allowing the peace to settle. He studied her more closely now. Her coat was patchy with frostburn, and her ribs still jutted like the outline of old bones. There were old scars on her haunches, and her paws were raw from travel. Whatever journey she'd taken to get here, it had nearly broken her. "You're lucky you found this place," he murmured. "Or maybe I'm the lucky one." The shepherd paused, lifting her gaze to meet his. For a second, the cabin felt impossibly quiet. Then, without warning, the gray pup let out a high-pitched squeak and tumbled onto its sibling. Tom chuckled softly. He didn't reach out. Not yet. But he whispered to himself, as much as to her, "We'll take it one day at a time." And this time, she didn't look away. By mid-morning, Tom had made his decision. He stood at the cabin's front window, watching the sky clear to a bright, frigid blue. The snow was thick and crusted with ice, but the storm had passed. The silence outside was almost too pure, too untouched. Inside, the shepherd lay curled beside the fire, both pups nursing quietly. Their tiny tails flicked now and then, a small show of life in a world that had nearly taken theirs. Tom turned from the window and grabbed his old landline phone. Cell reception didn't exist out here, but the phone still connected to the local line strung through the trees. He dialed the veterinary clinic in Sheridan, nearly 40 miles down the mountain. A voice answered on the second ring. "Wyoming Valley Vet, Dr. Lewis speaking." "Doc, it's Tom Grady," he said. "I've got a bit of a situation up here." He explained everything, how she'd shown up the night before, emaciated, freezing, guarding two newborns like her life depended on it. Because it probably had. Dr. Lewis didn't hesitate. "Bring them in. We'll clear a spot and be ready." Tom hung up and grabbed a canvas sled from the storage shed. After laying down blankets and a thick towel, he returned to the cabin and knelt a few feet from the shepherd. "Okay, girl," he said gently. "Time for a little road trip." She tensed the moment he reached for the pups. He stopped, letting her sniff his hand first. Then, with slow, deliberate movements, he picked them up, one in each arm, and placed them onto the sled's padded surface. The shepherd followed immediately, stepping onto the sled without command, positioning herself between Tom and her babies. Her eyes never left him. The drive down the mountain was slow and cautious. Tom's old pickup groaned over the icy backroads, snow chains clinking with every turn. He checked the rearview mirror constantly, glimpsing the sled he'd secured in the truck bed, the shepherd's ears barely visible above the rim. At the clinic, Dr. Lewis and two vet techs met him in the parking lot. They moved fast, hands trained and voices low. The shepherd growled once when they approached the pups, but Tom crouched beside her, placing a hand near her paw. "They're here to help," he murmured. She hesitated, then let the tech lift the pups onto a blanket-covered table. Dr. Lewis ran his hands over her ribs, his face growing more serious by the second. "She's underweight by at least 20 pounds. Scar tissue along the legs, that's old trauma. These aren't wilderness injuries. He looked at Tom. She's been abused. Or used for breeding. Maybe both. Tom's jaw tightened. The vet nodded toward the pups. They're fighters. But they wouldn't have survived another night. Neither would she. Tom exhaled slowly. Whatever her past had been, it had nearly destroyed her. But she hadn't let it. And now, neither would he. The return trip to Timber Creek was quiet. Tom kept one hand on the steering wheel and the other resting gently on the bench beside him, where the shepherd sat curled tightly. The pups were nestled in a towel-lined basket at her feet, sound asleep from the warmth of the clinic and the exhaustion of survival. Tom drove carefully through the winding roads, but his thoughts wandered. He glanced at the shepherd every so often. Her eyes were open, watching the snowy trees pass by through the window. Not tense. Not relaxed. Somewhere in between. A place he knew well. By the time they reached the cabin, the late afternoon sun had begun its descent, casting long shadows across the snowbanks. Tom lifted the pups into his arms first and nodded toward the porch. "Home," he said softly. The shepherd followed him inside without hesitation. He placed the pups in a newly arranged corner by the fireplace, a nest of folded blankets and the old dog bed. The shepherd walked over, sniffed the spot, and after a few seconds of circling, lowered herself slowly, curling around the pups. Tom stood a few feet away, hands on his hips, surveying the scene. "I guess this is official now." He walked into the kitchen, cracked open a can of the vet-recommended food, and spooned it into a dish. She ate slowly this time, not frantic like the first night. When she finished, she lifted her gaze to Tom and gave a quiet, rumbling exhale. He watched her for a moment. "Sage," he said, almost testing the word on his tongue. "Sagebrush. Tough. Survives the worst conditions." "Yeah. Sage." The shepherd blinked. Then she rested her head beside her pups and closed her eyes. Over the next week, Timber Creek thawed little by little under an unusually bright stretch of January sun, but the world inside the cabin changed far more. Each morning, Tom woke before sunrise to stoke the fire and brew coffee. By the time the scent filled the room, Sage would stretch and rise, gently nudging the pups awake. Tom began to notice the smallest things, how Sage would nose them into place before feeding, how the smaller one, Whistle, he'd named her, would always climb on top of her brother, Echo, for warmth. They had routines now. Tom set a feeding schedule. Sage took to sleeping closer to the center of the room rather than the edges. She flinched less when he moved nearby, no longer treating him like a stranger who might strike. Still, Tom never forced the bond. He didn't reach out unless Sage made the first move. He spoke to her like he would to a friend, low, calm, and steady. One evening, after a long day of chopping wood and clearing the roof, Tom returned to the cabin, boots caked with snow. Sage stood at the door before he even opened it. When it swung wide, she stepped forward, not away, and pressed her nose against his palm. That small touch lit something in him. He knelt down, heart suddenly too full, and stroked her fur gently behind the ears. She didn't flinch. She leaned into it. "You're something else," he whispered. Trust grew in quiet moments. Sage began sleeping more deeply, her breaths even and her body uncurled. The pups were growing fast, their legs still wobbly but gaining strength. They took to exploring the cabin, sniffing boots, bumping into furniture, tumbling over each other in a blur of fur and energy. Tom watched them often from his armchair, a worn blanket over his knees, a mug of coffee in hand. He found himself smiling more, speaking out loud when no one was around, because now, someone was. Someone was always listening. The cabin no longer felt empty. The silence that had once pressed in on him now felt soft, like the pause before music. At night, Sage sometimes rested near his chair while the pups played. He'd reach down and stroke her side, and she'd close her eyes, not from fear, but from peace. He still didn't know where she came from, what she'd survived, who had failed her. But he knew this much: she had chosen his door. And that meant something. Not just to her, but to him. It began with a feeling, quiet at first, just a whisper beneath the peace. Tom stood on the porch one morning, sipping his coffee, his breath forming soft clouds in the cold air. The sun hung low, casting a golden hue over the blanket of snow that stretched from the edge of the cabin down into the thick woods beyond. Timber Creek was calm, the forest silent. Too silent. Behind him, he could hear Sage's paws padding softly across the wooden floor. She'd started following him to the door each morning, watching as he scanned the tree line out of habit. Today, though, her ears perked higher. Her body stiffened. Tom noticed it instantly. "What is it?" he asked, lowering his mug. Sage stepped beside him, her eyes fixed on the far edge of the clearing. Her body grew tense, muscles coiled beneath her coat, tail low, but alert. Then she let out a low, guttural growl, a sound Tom hadn't heard from her since the night she arrived. He followed her gaze but saw nothing, just the quiet woods, still draped in fresh snow. Still, the unease settled deep in his gut like a cold stone. That day, the feeling didn't go away. As he chopped firewood, he kept glancing back toward the trees. As he fed the pups, who now tottered around the cabin like toddlers learning to walk, his ears stayed tuned to every rustle outside. Even Sage, usually calm now, paced near the windows when the sun began to dip behind the ridge. Something was off. That night, as the wind picked up again, Tom checked the locks on the doors and windows. He pulled the heavy curtains closed and set an extra log on the fire. Sage lay in her usual place near the hearth, but her head remained upright, ears twitching at every small creak the cabin made. Tom grabbed his old Winchester from the corner and placed it beside the armchair. "Just a precaution," he muttered, not really sure who he was trying to reassure, himself or Sage. He sat back down, the warmth from the fire brushing against his face, the pups curled beside their mother. Sage's eyes met his briefly before returning to the door. That was the first night the peace in Timber Creek fractured. The next morning brought more than cold air and coffee. Tracks. They weren't animal prints. Tom had spent enough time in the woods to know the difference. These were boot prints, large ones, half melted into the snow just beyond the edge of the clearing. He followed them carefully, rifle slung across his shoulder. They circled the cabin, came close to the porch, and disappeared into the woods on the far side. His mouth went dry. He crouched, examining one of the prints closely. The tread was deep, likely a heavy man. Judging by the spacing, someone had been standing still, watching. When he returned to the cabin, Sage met him at the door. She sniffed at his boots, then looked up at him, her body taut with restrained energy. Tom knelt beside her and placed a hand on her head. "You felt it too, didn't you?" That afternoon, he set trip alarms using fishing line and empty cans, old tricks from fireline camps and hunting days. He reinforced the back door and double-checked the generator's fuel. The pups, oblivious, chewed on an old glove near the fireplace while Sage never left the window. By dusk, the snow began to fall again, light this time, dusting the already frozen earth like ash. Tom sat near the fire with the rifle resting across his lap. He didn't speak much. He just listened. Sometime after midnight, he woke with a start. Not from noise. From silence. The fire had dimmed, the room shadowed and quiet. Then a sound, barely there. A single, soft crunch in the snow outside. Sage sprang up beside him, every hair on her back raised. She didn't bark. She didn't move. She just stared at the door, a low rumble growing in her throat. Tom grabbed the rifle and moved to the window, pulling the curtain back just a sliver. At the edge of the woods stood a figure. Tall. Still. Cloaked in shadow. Watching. He froze. The figure didn't move. Didn't speak. After a long moment, it turned slowly and disappeared into the tree line without a sound. Tom stood motionless for another full minute. Then he backed away from the window, heart pounding. He looked down at Sage. She met his gaze, and this time, there was something more than alertness in her eyes. There was recognition. And fear. The next morning, the air was brittle with cold. The snow, untouched in some places, sparkled like crushed glass beneath the pale sun. Tom hadn't slept much. He sat on the porch steps, rifle across his lap, eyes scanning the trees like a man waiting for a storm that hadn't finished. Sage sat beside him, her body stiff, ears alert. The pups played behind the cabin, tumbling in the snow under a watchful eye, but even their carefree yips seemed quieter today, as if they too felt something stirring beneath the surface. Then Tom saw movement, slow, deliberate, just beyond the tree line. A man stepped out from the shadows. He was tall, broad-shouldered, wrapped in a heavy, weather-worn coat. His jeans were stained, boots caked with old mud, and a rope dangled loosely from his gloved hand. His hood shaded his face, but the smirk on his lips was plain as day. Tom stood, leveling the rifle in his arms. "That's far enough." The man stopped, just a few feet past the porch. "Easy there, old man. Just came to pick up my dog." Tom's grip tightened. "Your dog?" "German Shepherd. Female. 2 pups. I've been looking for her." His tone was too calm, like someone used to getting what he wanted. Tom didn't move. "She showed up here half-starved and half-frozen, carrying those pups through a damn blizzard. If she was yours, you sure didn't treat her like it." The man shrugged, casual. "She ran off. These dogs, sometimes they get nervous. Maternal instincts or whatever. But she's mine." From beside him, Sage let out a low, building growl. Her body had gone rigid. Her eyes were locked on the man, and her lips had curled just enough to show teeth. Tom didn't need her to speak to understand what that meant. "You need to leave," Tom said firmly. The man took one step closer. "I think we both know I'm not leaving without her." Tom raised the rifle an inch. "One more step, and you'll be the one needing rescue." The smirk disappeared. Behind Tom, the door creaked open. The pups had wandered toward the edge of the porch, their heads tilted in curiosity. Sage immediately moved in front of them, placing herself between them and the stranger. And that's when it happened. Her growl turned into something deeper, wilder, almost a snarl. Her eyes widened. She lowered her head and took one slow step forward. Recognition. Not just fear, memory. This wasn't a stranger. This was someone she'd escaped from. The man hesitated now. "She's dangerous. You don't know what that dog's been through." Tom didn't blink. "No. But I know exactly what kind of man lets her get that way." The rope slipped from the man's hand and hit the snow with a soft thud. "You're making a mistake." "No," Tom said, voice low and steady. "The mistake was thinking you could come back here." Sage's snarl deepened, but she didn't lunge. She didn't need to. Her stance said it all. The man backed away slowly, step by step, eyes darting between the dog and the rifle. Tom kept his aim steady until the stranger vanished into the woods, the crunch of his boots fading into the trees. Only then did Tom lower the rifle. He turned to Sage, who was still braced, her breath fast, her body coiled like a spring. "He's gone," Tom whispered, his voice shaking now. You're safe. He's gone. She looked up at him. Then, slowly, she walked over and pressed her head against his leg. For the first time, she leaned in, not for warmth, not for fear, but for comfort. Tom rested his hand on her head, the rifle forgotten at his side. I'm not letting him take you back, he said quietly. Not now. Not ever. Behind them, the pups pawed at the edge of the step, unaware of how close they'd come to losing everything. But Sage knew. And so did Tom. The past had knocked on their door. But they hadn't opened it. Tom bolted the door behind him, every lock clicking into place with purpose. The silence that followed felt heavier than before, like the cabin itself was holding its breath. Outside, the trees swayed gently, masking the path the stranger had vanished down. Snowflakes began to fall again, soft and slow, as if trying to bury the morning's fear. Sage stood in the center of the room, her body finally easing from its tight coil. Her ears twitched, still alert, but the wild tension had left her muscles. Tom walked over, knelt down, and gently placed his hands on either side of her face. She didn't pull away. You did good, girl, he whispered. You protected them. You protected all of us. The pups clambered over to her then, one tumbling into his lap before squeaking and rolling away. Sage turned her head and began licking their faces, nuzzling them close with a gentleness that only a mother could give. Tom stood and crossed the room to the old writing desk tucked beneath the window. He pulled open the bottom drawer and rummaged through a pile of papers until he found what he was looking for, a manila folder labeled adoption and registration forms. It had been years since he'd needed it. It was yellowed at the edges and slightly warped from time, but it was intact. He grabbed a pen and opened it. By the time he finished filling out the forms, the sky had begun to darken. The storm was coming again. He didn't care. Tomorrow, he'd drive into Sheridan. He'd sign every paper, pay whatever fee was needed, and register Sage and the pups in his name. They weren't visitors anymore. They were home. Later that evening, he stoked the fire and sat back in his old armchair, a mug of tea warming his hands. Sage lay beside him on the rug, one paw draped protectively over Echo, who had fallen asleep on her chest. Whistle was curled at Tom's feet, breathing slow and steady. He looked down at them, then over at Sage. There was something different in her eyes now. The wariness was still there, it might never fully leave, but layered beneath it was something quieter, deeper. Peace. Trust. And gratitude. You're not just healing, he said softly. You're teaching me how to heal, too. The cabin no longer echoed with emptiness. The silence had shape now, filled with the rhythm of breathing, the rustle of paws on floorboards, the occasional yip from a dreaming pup. Tom leaned his head back and closed his eyes. He hadn't planned for any of this. Hadn't wanted anything to change. But sometimes life had its own way of knowing what a heart needs before the mind can catch up. He reached down and gently ran his fingers along Sage's back. She stirred, blinked up at him, and rested her head on his foot. For the first time in years, Tom felt a sense of rightness. The kind of rightness that didn't need to be explained. Just lived. And protected. The story of Tom and the German Shepherd, Sage, is more than a tale of survival in a frozen wilderness, it's a powerful reminder of trust, healing, and second chances. Sometimes, the souls who appear in our lives unexpectedly are exactly what our hearts have been quietly searching for. Sage, abandoned and wounded, still protected her pups with unwavering devotion and sought refuge. Tom, a man who had closed the door on the world after deep loss, found purpose again in a single, desperate gaze from a mother dog. The message is clear. Whether human or animal, pain does not define us. With kindness, patience, and compassion, anyone can find home again. Everyone deserves a second chance. Let this story remind us that even the smallest act of compassion can save a life. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more emotional, real-life stories of loyalty, courage, and the extraordinary bonds between humans and animals. Share this video with someone who might need hope today. You never know who's quietly struggling. And if you can, consider adopting or supporting a rescue animal. Sometimes, giving a home doesn't just save a creature, it saves the person who opens their door. Thank you for being part of this journey. Together, we can make the world a little warmer, one story at a time.